Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Roy from MIT. I'm going to talk today about how symbols and actions are connected. This is joint work with Mike Noseworthy, Dayang Park, Rohan Paul, and Subro Roy. This is going to be a little bit of a different talk because I'm not going to actually talk that much about language. But I am going to talk about representations that I think are really representations of actions that are really important for connecting language and how robots operate in the world. Let me explain in more detail what I mean. So there's lots of examples of robots doing complicated things in the world. We have self-driving cars, we have inspection drones, we have delivery drones, we have large numbers of robot manipulators doing increasingly more impressive things all the time. But one of the things is that these robots, as good as what they're doing as they still fundamentally are only doing one thing, which is getting from point A in the configuration space to point B in the configuration space. And as soon as the mission gets more complicated and you need the robot to do more complicated things than that, then things start to break down a little bit, the systems get brittle, and there's an awful lot of hand engineering, an awful lot of supervision required to actually get the system to work. So why is that? Let's think about the architecture of most robots. All of the robots in the videos I showed on the previous slide work more or less like this, which is that there's some low-level loop that runs relatively quickly. It's got a fast duty cycle. And the way it works is that there's some sensor that takes measurements from the world. That sensor creates a state estimate, maybe of the vehicle's pose and attitude, maybe of the environment around it. It's doing mapping as well. And that state estimate is given to a motion planner that constructs a trajectory that hopefully gets the robot closer to its goal while avoiding collisions and other bad things. That reference trajectory is given to a controller, which has to follow it, and then that controller outputs commands to the motors. And this works extremely well. But this is the thing that gets a robot from point A to point B in the configuration space. How do we actually execute more complicated tasks? Inevitably, and almost every single fielded robot today works something like this, is that state estimate is used to extract some kind of symbolic state estimate, such as position, such as being on a particular route for a self-driving car, or maybe being in a room for a service robot. And then that state is then given to a symbolic planner that decides on some high-level task and maybe some high-level sub-goal. And that high-level sub-goal is then fed down to the motion planner. And the motion planner uses that sub-goal from the symbolic planner to make progress through the mission. And this thing at the top runs relatively slowly, spitting out sub-goals to motion planners, and this thing down here runs relatively quickly. And what's worth noting is that this part down here is the thing that works really well. We know that robots, self-driving cars, delivery drones, et cetera, they're able to execute motion plans relatively reliably and robustly. It's this thing up here that inevitably breaks. It's this thing up here where we encounter edge cases we didn't think about, or the robot gets itself, into some kind of state where somebody has to recognize something's gone wrong and they have to rescue it. So why is that? Well, I'm going to circle all these arrows here in green. These arrows here in green depend on models. Actually, every arrow in this diagram depends on some kind of model. And the arrows that I circled in green are things that we actually know how to learn from data. So things like system identification allow us to take sensor data and feed that as a model for the estimator. Similarly, we know how to do system identification to build a plant model for the controller, and so on. And we even can use a lot of learning techniques to learn how symbolic states should predict symbolic actions that then generate low-level motion plans. But notice that I can't actually circle every arrow on this slide in green. We know how to learn these things from data. These arrows here, we don't actually know how to learn from data as a community. But inevitably, what ends up happening is that some engineer or some graduate student sits down and writes some C++ or Python that says how to extract from the current state estimate what your symbolic state is, that says how to extract from the estimated position of the vehicle what route segment is on in some kind of hand-created route map. Similarly, we have some Python or C++ code that basically describes how to turn, say, the fact that you need to go to a room for a service robot into a goal for the motion planner. And that hand engineering of these relationships between low-level physics and geometry and high-level symbolic or abstract states is really, really hard to do. And so what ends up happening is that the engineer or the graduate student who tries to write down these mappings forgets that edge case or doesn't quite get it right. And then the robot breaks and somebody comes in and says, oh, I forgot something, or I need to grow the model a little bit. And then they write some more Python or C++ code and the robot starts to work again until it doesn't. And this is highly unsatisfying. The things that work well for robotics and a lot of what we want our computers to do these days depend very much on our ability to write down a well-posed learning problem, collect data, and then train up models. And so a question we might ask ourselves is, why do we have this system up here? Why do we actually have to go from low-level geometry to like abstract representations and back again? And the reason we need to do that is because complicated tasks are too hard to solve entirely as motion planners. Everything in computer science that drives abstraction is based on being able to do things more efficiently and more scalably. And so we know that we need these symbolic representations. I had a theory for a while that the way that we actually could get these symbolic representations was based on language. And so many of you may know that for a while I was working on with my students, following instructions in symbolic planning. And so the question was, given a robot and some language that a human partner had given to the robot, you could go past, say go past the elevators, through the door, down the hallway to the conference room on your left. Could we compute a plan? And the answer was yes, if you took this representation of the world and extracted things like routes through the corridors, you could actually infer a minimum cost plan that matched the instructions. And we had a bunch of nice probabilistic machinery that allowed you to learn how to do this. And it was based on this idea of a grounding graph. That given that sentence that we had, we could decompose that sentence into basically individual words, or snippets of language. And we could learn a mapping that said that what was the likelihood that stuff in the world, trajectories or objects, corresponded to the language that you were given. And so if you're computing the likelihood of correspondence, then you can usually learn those likelihoods from data. And that actually worked very well. And we had a series of results that allowed us to do interesting things with the robots. But the thing that I didn't pay a lot of attention to up till now was that when we were decomposing the language, you taking advantage of the hierarchical and compositional structure of an entire sentence, like go past the elevators, etc. I also needed to decompose the stuff in the world in a similar way. And so we needed to have abstractions over stuff in the world in order to learn what eventually was a statistical translation problem. So I needed a way to represent actions as basically discrete routes through the environment. And then I could compute the likelihood of correspondence of a discrete or abstract route through the environment and the language that we were given. And so what that really meant was that we need a representation of actions that allow us to extract abstractions. And this raises the question of what are good abstract representations of actions that allow us to extract abstractions and then do things like learn the mapping from language to those actions. Those abstractions are not just for language, however, they also allow us to infer more complex plans in less time, and they also allow us to learn faster. So the rest of this talk is basically going to be about learning abstractions of actions that we might use for language grounding, but we also might just use for learning how to do different tasks. So learning to do different tasks is often posed as learning from demonstration. And learning from demonstration has been very successful in the last few years in learning to do complex tasks that obey all kinds of dynamic and kinematic requirements. One of the problems with learning from demonstration, however, is that it tends to operate at a very low-level representation of the task. And so that low-level representation limits what we can do in terms of expressive tasks, how we can scale those tasks, how compactly we can represent them, and also how easy it is to learn these tasks. A lot of learning from demonstration right now requires an awful lot of data. And that's really hard to get at a lot of the time. Representing a task or demonstrating a task over and over and over again gets very boring for human demonstrators. So the question is, how do we learn from a single demonstration? And the hypothesis of this work is that we need a better understanding of our tasks. So how can we learn from a single demonstration? A lot of learning from demonstration actually gets recast as inverse reinforcement learning, where the task is represented as a reward. This is not the only way you can do a learning from demonstration, but this is one way that you can do learning from demonstration. And it works reasonably well, but it is, it can be very data inefficient. And about 8 years ago, Buddy Machini and John Howe showed that you could actually drive down the data requirements by using Bayesian non-parametric techniques to infer not that a representation of the task as a reward function, but as a representation of the task as sub-goals. And that was very nice because you didn't need quite as much data, but you still needed quite a few demonstrations even to do what Buddy and John were able to do. One of the things, this is the work primarily of my former postdoc, Dayang Park, who's now at KAIST. And Dayang noticed that, that recently a lot of people have noticed that constraints, kinematic constraints in particular, are really useful not for learning from demonstration, but they're useful for actually just planning. For instance, Schmidt et al. About 5 years ago noticed that if you actually encoded kinematic constraints and put them into the planning process, oftentimes you could prune away a lot of the search space by noticing the constraints themselves would prune away the search space. Kim and Seo also noticed that constraints often reduce the number of degrees of freedom of the planning problem, which also reduced the complexity of the planning problem. So the question is, can we actually use constraints in learning from demonstration? And can we actually use constraints to drive down the data complexity so we can do this with a single demonstration? And we're going to show how we can do this by introducing constraints into the process. And what Dayang developed is, along with colleagues, a constraint-based Bayesian non-parametric inverse reinforcement learning technique. And it really is a new way of representing the tasks. One thing to note that we are by no means the first people to actually try and put constraints into the learning from demonstration problem. So Aaron Bobick and a student did this many years ago in learning to learn hand gestures. And more recently, Dimitri Berenson and his student learned how to do tasks like wheel insertion. And so the core idea here is that constraints actually represent invariance in the motion, which makes learning easier because it naturally reduces the complexity of the hypothesis space for learning. But one of the problems with how constraints have been included is they're typically thought of as global constraints. But there's a lot of problems where constraints are actually local. So take this hammering motion right here. We don't want, so there's a bunch of constraints, obviously. So one constraint is like you need the hammer to be in contact with the head. You also have constraints that says you don't want the hammer to be in contact with the thumb. But those constraints really only matter through part of the motion. The hammer and the nail head can't be in contact except for a very short amount of time. And so you can't put that constraint into learning during the downward swing of the hammer and the retraction. But learning local constraints is hard. If you're going to have global constraints, you basically just have the problem of knowing, if the constraints are on or not during the demonstration or not. However, when you're learning local constraints, you have the problem of learning both which constraints are active, but also when they're active in which part of the demonstrated trajectory. So you have to learn the region of activation and which constraints are active. And so that's a hard problem. If you have if you have multiple demonstrations, then it becomes easier because you can treat the problem of inferring the regions of active constraints as essentially a clustering problem. And you have multiple demonstrations, and so you can cluster when features might be active and when the constraints might not be active. But again, the issue here is that we want to do this with as few demonstrations as possible. What we'd really like is for a human, to demonstrate a task and possibly even provide language annotation of what they're doing as they demonstrate the task. Do it once and the robot knows how to do it. So how can we actually learn when a constraint encoded as features might be active in a single demonstration? So the key insight that allows us to do this is to notice that a constraint naturally drives down the variance of the trajectory. So a trajectory, may have, as you swing a hammer, especially without any particular active constraints, the motion of that hammer is going to, be relatively high variance relative to some low dimensional representation. Or if you're moving from the figure of the robot putting up a clamp over a pipe, the motion of that clamp is going to be relatively high variance throughout the trajectory over time as it's approaching the pipe, and then it's going to be low variance. So the question is, can we actually search for partitions in a single trajectory that are partitioned by the variance of the trajectory? So the idea here, as you can see, is that if we partition this sort of toy example, you can see that the motion of the trajectory, along a feature of the trajectory is going to be low variance. The x component, well, I guess this is a one-dimensional trajectory. So no, it's a two-dimensional trajectory. The x component of the trajectory or excuse me, the y dimension of the trajectory is relatively constant in the first partition, but in the 0th partition, in the second partition, it's obviously not. And so can we use that idea of the variance of partition to notice when constraints might be active? And it's easy to understand how constraints naturally constrain the motion, which reduces the variance. And so let us imagine that we actually had a good decomposition. Let's imagine that some oracle handed us this decomposition. We can then look at the variance, and then given a set of constraints, we can actually infer, assuming that the constraints impose restrictions on the geometry of the trajectory, we can look at which constraints are reducing the variance of the trajectory in each place. And we can see that, in different partitions, different constraints might be active, and in this last partition, no constraints are active. So inferring how constraints reduce variance given a partition is relatively easy. But what we need to do is we need to infer the joint of the partitions and the active constraints. And at this point, we essentially appeal to statistical clustering. And we use a blocked Gibbs sampler to actually infer both the partitions and the active constraints in those partitions. Blocked Gibbs sampler, essentially a non-parametric technique, and that also means that we don't have to predefine the number of partitions as well as the number of constraints. So the actual learning process then is given a demonstrated trajectory, such as the robot trying to put a clamp over this pipe. We extract features from the trajectory, and then from those features of the trajectories, we try and infer both partitioning and the active constraints along where the partition is along the time duration of the trajectory. Then, given a new problem, such as passing the clamp over, the goal in this case is to put the clamp at the base of this more complicated pipe. We first extract a representation of the pipe using ICP. We initially assume no constraints, and then we do inference over the partition of this pipe here, as well as the subgoals, which represent the partitions, the ends of each partition, and then the constraints that are active in each partition along. And then we generate that given the constraints and the subgoals, that's a relatively simple motion planning problem. The question you might have is, what kind of features are we using in order to encode the constraints? And right now, these are relatively intuitive geometric features, such as progress along the trajectory, distance of the end effector from the pipe, the extent to which the end effector aligns with objects and orientation, etc. So how does this actually perform with this new constrained inverse reinforcement learning compared to just regular subgoal? So given a single demonstration of the robot passing a clamp over a straight pipe, we see in the top left what happens if Bayesian non-parametric inverse reinforcement learning is given two subgoals. It can't do the task at all because there is no collision-free path. Or if you try and execute the collision-free path in the top left, you'll have a collision. If you give more subgoals, as many as 17 subgoals, you can see that the robot is able to make a little bit more progress, but it actually does get stuck around that the bend of the towards the second to last subgoal. If, however, we impose constraints on the trajectories from subgoal to subgoal, then we are able to solve this problem with exactly two subgoals, and that's very satisfying. The reduction in number of subgoals ultimately leads to much more efficient planning. But it gives us a greater degree of generalization. in the sense that we can plan, we can, given a single demonstration, we can generalize very satisfyingly to these much more complicated tasks. And so if we look at these sort of, if we train on the straight pipe, and then we test on the straight pipe, all of these different techniques do well. But as we get to more and more complicated tasks, our approaches, so this U-shaped pipe or this, sort of weird S-shaped pipe, Bayesian nonparametric inverse reinforcement learning is able to do well still on both of these, but eta here basically corresponds to how many sub-goals you need to give, and it's a lot. And here, so it's as many as 17 sub-goals, and that of course affects computation time substantially. For us, we need, as the eta here is implies many fewer sub-goals, and so we're able to do well with somewhere between 2 and 8 sub-goals, depending on the task at hand. And so just to demonstrate that this really works in practice, again, the robot has been trained on a single vertical pipe. And by extracting an abstraction of the task as a partition into sub-goals and active constraints, the robot is able to, having seen that one demonstration, able to pass the clamp over the same example I've been showing you before very nicely. This is an 8 times sped up video. The robot is going relatively slowly, but it's able to do the task very nicely. So hopefully I've convinced you that we do need better representations of tasks, and especially the discrete representation as a series of sub-goals and active constraints is something that allowed us to learn from a single demonstration. The hope is that we get it. The plan is to connect it to language. That hasn't happened yet. But we're excited about that kind of representation, enabling a human operator to communicate more complex tasks much more easily. Truth in advertising, we are encoding a fair amount of domain knowledge. We are encoding, we do know the geometry of the domain ahead of time, and we're also specifying the feature functions that drive constraints. And one of the next things we want to do is see if we can use techniques such as graph neural networks to actually try and learn the space of features and constraints automatically. It's also hard to explore the entire space of constraints. So as we get more, as the number of features increases, the number of constraints increases, we do start to see computational complexity limitations as well. But so far things work reasonably well. So that's one way in which we need a better representation of actions allowed us to inform our complex plans and allowed us to learn faster. But notice that I didn't actually say what I did was demonstrated that we can learn the what of a particular task. But there's another set of things you might want to learn from demonstration, which is the how to do a task. So how do we represent complete actions? Imagine that we're trying to do learning from demonstration, and we're trying to do a task like pouring. So pouring is basically the successful motion of contents of one vessel into contents of another vessel. And you could try and learn to pour the same way every time, and the learning from demonstration, the constraint-based Bayesian nonparametric IRL might get you that. But there are different ways that we might want to pour. We might want to pour slowly. We might want to pour quickly. We might want to pour gently or aggressively, etc. Notice that I'm using different adverbs to describe different ways of pouring. I wouldn't want to have to learn what those adverbs meant for every single different task that we might do. I wouldn't want to have to learn how to pour slowly and separately from stirring slowly, separately from pushing slowly. The idea is that a lot of the tasks that we do have parameters that are task specific and parameters that describe the how of things that really generalize across tasks. Essentially, there's a set of parameters. So a lot of parameters that we use to describe a task are specified explicitly by the task, such as where, for how long to do it, the angle, etc. And then there's a bunch of parameters that actually that you might use to actually complete the rest of the task. And what we actually might want to do is disentangle the how of a task from a lot of these other discovered parameters that encode the rest of the task that we might actually want to vary from task to task. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is work primarily of Mike Noseworthy along with colleagues. And what Mike noticed is that we could actually set up a task condition variational autoencoder, which conditioned the task parameters that is conditioned on learning the task parameters to discover latent space that encodes the remaining parameters. So we essentially have a demonstration of a task. We encode that, then we specify the task parameters as part of the decoder, and then the encoder is encoding the task in the latent space, and then we use an adversarial loss to remove information about the task parameters from the latent space that don't correspond explicitly to the task itself. And so essentially we have an alternating optimization problem that minimizes the amount of information in the latent space that encodes the task parameters to give us a disentangled set of the remaining discovered parameters. And so we evaluated our method on pouring demonstrations using this very nice data set from Sharma et al. From a couple of years ago. And here for pouring, we might just want to say the task parameters are the location of the pour. And then we can discover the remaining parameters that describe the rest of the trajectory. And this allows us to actually vary the rest of the trajectory. For instance, we can show that if we control, one of the latent parameters might be the duration, and so we can learn to control pour slowly, or we can learn to pour quickly. And so by actually explicitly varying H as input to the decoder, we can recover different pouring trajectories while essentially keeping the pour location the same. And so essentially what we've done is we've discovered a representation of speed here. Again, slowly, might correspond to an adverb that you would then hope would generalize across other tasks as well. By actually using the task conditioned autoencoder, we can actually explicitly pull out a representation of the task that might generalize across other tasks that would again allow us to learn faster or express express different plans given a particular language. My hope, so one thing that one thing we haven't done yet is we haven't connected the task condition variational autoencoder to the learning from a single demonstration yet. Unfortunately, so far, the task condition autoencoder does require multiple demonstrations and is relatively data inefficient so far. So more work to be done there. But really, what hopefully I've demonstrated here is that we really need a new theory of representation that allows us to find abstractions of the continuous physical world that allows us to joint inference in a principled fashion. We really want to learn representations that correspond to the structure of the world, and we also ultimately want abstractions that correspond to the human understanding of the world. And something that I didn't talk about today, but I think is really important, is we want to be able to represent the unexpected also without having seen it, which is of course another really crucial capability of an awful lot of abstractions in language and other places. So with that, I'll conclude and say thank you very much. Look forward to meeting many of you during the panel discussions during the workshop. And I want to say thank you to the organizers for putting this together in these very difficult times. Thanks very much.